I was very much in the hub of a very Coptic community in Bayonne. And my dad was very much working class and trying to move up into the upper echelons of middle class, like office, air conditioned type of nice living. And then was told that there was already a diversity quota, so they don't need him. They have a person of color already in the office. So he quit and said, peace out. I've worked too long for this company to really, Rite Aid, by the way. I've worked too long and stressed too much and have too many talents for this.
What is Al Mahaba?
Yeah. So a lot of things to different people, but I will keep the baseline as it's a community responsive center and organization in South Nashville, serving primarily Arabic speaking folks, but we serve all our neighbors in South Nashville. So obviously we had started very much so, very Coptic, then we saw a lot of Muslims coming into the program, and then we have a lot of Latinx folks coming in now. So while we do target a lot of Arabic speaking folks, particularly Egyptian Christians in our programming, and prioritize them, as they don't have many services targeting and prioritizing them, we do serve a good amount of people in South Nashville. Yeah.
It's amazing.
A very small morsel here. Yeah.
But you're doing great work, and you're getting people together, and you're creating attention, bringing attention to something that needs to be discussed, and a community that needs you.
No, needs each other. We'll say that. What about Egypt Migrations? That's a long story too.
Really, Egypt Migrations has three functions. It's to preserve at archives and through oral histories, the histories, memories, and experiences of all of Egypt's migrants. It's to educate, so through our online educational resources, compiling digital resources across the web and putting them on the site, through podcasts and through the blog, and through events that we used to host pre-COVID, like the conference you attended, to educate Egyptians, to educate society more broadly across Canada, across the United States, about Egypt's migrants, and to leave a legacy for future generations to learn. And then the third aspect is empowering young Egyptians. And so scholars of Egypt, young Egyptians across the diaspora, providing a space to write and to receive editorial feedback from us on their writing, providing a space to intern with us or volunteer with us and learn about the history and heritage of all of Egypt's migrants, and the diversity of Egypt and the diversity of our communities, and to push towards change, towards collaboration with others beyond our community.
Yeah, I love that ending part too, is the collaboration part of all of it. Yeah, because we kind of forget that how important archives are too. Like, people just think it's someone funneling things into a box and here's some letters and just chuck it into a room and that's it. But there's like a lot of important things that come out of archives, and even like in doing them. Yeah.
Honestly, my research would not have happened if somebody hadn't done that. Like, I did my master's back in 2013, 2014, and I was so lost as to what am I gonna do? Where am I gonna find this information on the Coptic community in Toronto? And I go to Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa, and I find this file on the Coptic Church, mislabeled, set aside in an Anglican church box. But it was, when I started looking into it, it was all of these letters from Bishop Samuel in Egypt to the Coptic Church in Toronto. It included pamphlets and advertisements, and it was donated by an unknown person. And so, like, whoever it was, this wonderful person, saw the value of this material, put it in an archive, and it allowed me to write my master's and then to build on it for my PhD and to write a dissertation on Coptic migrations in the 20th century.
We have to be able to preserve ourselves, and then they see a lot of what we've created as something not worth preserving too. So that's an issue. Like, why do you want to take pictures of a mechanic shop? Like, this is worth noting. This is important.
100%.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, like the fact that you know, Black, white, Latinx folks know about this mechanic shop and visit it often, and it's Coptic owned. That's important. It's not an enclave unto itself. It's saying something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we don't have those stories. I mean, a lot of the times when people write on the Copts, they're writing about the Copts as the Copts, right?
Yeah.
Who, you know, stick to themselves, don't interact. But in everyday life, you know, we do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, yeah, the crazy part of all of it is just very much, yeah, folks want to see us as very insular and very unique, and our stories are intersecting with other stories and creating larger stories in Nashville. So it's
Absolutely.
just about making sure that the mainstream dominant narrative that's here in Nashville about Coptic folks is one that stays, obviously, but and noted, but is not doesn't remain the dominant one, hopefully.
What is your migration story? Who are you?
I guess all my migrations have been within the United States. So my parents are immigrants, and my father came in 1983 and my mom in 1989. And they met from, long story, my father's cousins who knew my mom, and then we're like, we have a cousin in New Jersey because she was in Virginia. And then they met, and she moved to New Jersey with him and had me. So I was very much in the hub of a very Coptic community in Bayonne. And my dad was very much working class and trying to move up into the upper echelons of middle class, like office, air conditioned type of nice living. And then was told that he, there was already a diversity quota, so they don't need him. They have a person of color already in the office. So he quit and said, peace out. I've worked too long for this company to really, Rite Aid, by the way. I've worked too long and stressed too much and have too many talents for this. So he moved down to Tennessee, where my mother's family first came because her brother married a white woman who is from Kentucky, Tennessee. So when they sponsored my mother, she came into Tennessee. So that's how we ended up in the South, even though my father had always stayed up north. So it was very much a culture shock for him after almost 2 decades in the north of the United States and then coming south with my mom. And it was also very important to have family. So my story is very unique in Nashville because I grew up with some extensive family here, which is something most Coptic people don't have here in Nashville. And also because we were one of the first families here, but we were also not working at Vanderbilt University, or my dad was not an engineer or a doctor. He doesn't have a college degree, so he was working at JCPenney in the delivery dock. So very different from a lot of the other small families that were in Nashville in the beginning. And of course, when the boom happened here in Nashville in 1994, 3 years after we came here, my dad found his niche. He was like, I will provide for the immigrants who are coming through. And so very much been a lifelong Nashville resident, which is also rare because of the migrations that are happening to Nashville now. So I kind of grew up in the suburbs of Nashville, and then we would go to Nashville for dad's job, for church. So I spent half and half of my life, kind of in the suburbs with a lot of white people, and then the culture shock of that, and then being with Egyptians half the time, like 3 days of the week, or all my summers with all the Coptic folks, and then coming back to school and being with like non-Egyptians. So obviously, because of that, that has informed a lot of who I am, to kind of see how the other half lives, and how the other half views me and how they treated me. And then seeing that it's not just about you, that they treat your mom that way, they treat another Coptic person that way, they treat the Coptic people moving south for work into the suburbs, they treat them that way too. So it's not just about you, it's about your community coming into the suburbs and what that means, and the suburbs going into your community as well on the weekends. My brother was caught up in the segregation period of the school, where they were, my parents managed to get us into an all-white school, or sorry, 90% white school. And then by the time my sister and I moved to high school, they were very much working to segregate that school again. And so my brother got caught up in that mess as well. And that's informed a lot of why I work with youth as well. So yeah, there's a lot of migration between the north and the south, between the suburbs and the city, between Antioch, that has a negative reputation here, in Nashville in general, moving into Melwood, which is significantly poorer than Antioch. And so moving into all these areas and seeing the diversity of Nashville and having that sense of who you are and all that. So, yeah. How about you, Mark?
My life has been very much tied to Egypt. Despite the fact I immigrated to Toronto with my family in the early 90s, I was only 8. We come from Alexandria. My family owned an architectural firm there. And before that, my grandfather and his brother migrated to Alexandria in the 20s from Asyut. And they had a very long history there. And it's really their story that always captured my attention when I was young. Living in Toronto, I'd always sit around the table with the adults as a kid and listen to all the stories. Growing up, I was enamored by history. My grandfather and his brother, when they moved to Alexandria, they apprenticed for Italian architects. And they worked with Armenians, and they even built 2 Catholic churches and a Protestant church in Alexandria. They built over 30 Coptic Orthodox churches in Alexandria. And so like their story of arriving and settling and building a company and growing through their connections to the Coptic Patriarch in Alexandria was always very powerful, very moving. And it is Alexandria, right? And so the city itself, it just has this quality that no matter how much it changes and you hate the change, you can't help but love it. Yeah. And that's why history, like all of that. Right. I ended up, all of that migration, all of that, stories that I grew up with. And as I got older, I continued on in history. And I wanted to know more. And I wanted to understand why my family, doesn't really talk about our history in Asyut, or talks about it in vague terms. Why there is, within the Coptic community more broadly, like classist undertones in how you discuss Said, as opposed to Copts living in Alexandria or Cairo. I mean, I say undertones, a lot of times it's very explicit. Uh, and I also wanted to understand, you know, the role of the church in Egypt and in the diaspora. I wanted to understand what makes this Coptic story a part of Egypt's story and a part of international migrations in the 20th century. And so my dissertation, which I'm working on turning into a book now, is really about, you know, cosmopolitanism, kind of like that mechanic shop that you talked about. It's about how you have in Egypt, in Alexandria, my grandfather and his brother working with Greeks, Armenians, Italians. And you have in Toronto or in New York or in Montreal, Copts interacting with and intersecting with Jordanians and Iraqis and Yemeni immigrants, right? And how, like, the earliest Egyptian immigrant associations in the 70s were made up of Egyptian Christians, Muslims, Jews, and they had regular picnics and sports competitions with the Lebanese of Egypt Club or the Greeks of Egypt Club in Toronto, right? So, like, these are things we don't learn. These are things we don't really know because the Copts are always written as insular, but they're not. And Egypt Migrations is an extension of that for me, because Egypt Migrations is driven by one single word, and it's the main argument of my dissertation. It's heteroglossia, of varied and opposing voices. It's a literary term, and it pretty much is an attempt to capture overlapping and intersecting narratives. And that's what I hope to accomplish with Egypt Migrations. That's what I hope to accomplish with my research and writing. And in a sense, it's all born of my migration story. And I sort of jumped the gun, because the next question was, how does your background shape your work?
One, there's a lot of privilege in my story of migration. So there were a lot of moments, the fact that my uncle married a white woman, and so she knew, when you come to Tennessee, as a white woman, don't live in these areas because your kids are going to not have the resources they need growing up, go into the suburbs. And that my father, well, we're all middle class, and that I'm light-skinned. So there are a lot of privileges that I have within the Coptic community and within Nashville itself that kind of lend that my parents were very big on me speaking English, that they made sure that I was focusing on that and putting me into schools that were focusing on that too, because they knew how ugly it gets when you don't speak English and how easily that can isolate you and segregate you. So the fact that they had been here years before they had gotten me also set the path for them to be prepared to put me on the path that they wanted to. So there were a lot of privileges in my life in that, in the story that I related. And there's just a lot of also, because I grew up around a lot of white people half the time, that I knew how the other side lived, and I knew the crime of what was happening in South Nashville. So as much as I spoke to a lot of white people, so again, like, the first thing that I would get from white people is, where are you from? After that, what does your dad do? Oh, you know, you're Egyptian, okay. And then they go into this whole thing about the pyramids, and then, like, where should I visit? Where should I eat? It depends on if they're liberal or conservative, where they take the trajectory. Liberals always want food options. And then conservatives always want to speak about, like, how bad it is in Egypt, and the politics. So it was constant bombardment. And then also feeling that, that there are that there are certain people living in Franklin and Brentwood um, who are using a lot of the labor, and Coptic labor specifically, but also not specifically, to get this wealth, to live in like $10 million houses. So something my mom always liked to do was drive down Franklin Road with me, which is in Brentwood, and it's like literally these $15-20 million houses, huge, you know, manicured lawns, and my mom would love to look at this because it's aesthetically pleasing, in essence. But it's just one of those like, wow, look at this house. I wonder how they live. I wonder how much they pay for this, and like, what's their life like? And they work 3 days or like only 4 days a week, and they have a maid, and then they go take their classes, and then like, I'd like to learn woodworking, and all this like, you know, imagination that would go on half the time. And then you would see on the other half folks who like came in and they're like, I want to go to college in the United States, and then it trickles down when they're working at Tyson Factory. Or you would sit in a salon at someone's house, and they've just been in the hospital, or they've just had a baby, and they're just like, you know, we'll see if we're going to go back to Egypt with this baby. I don't know if they're going to see their grandmother. The grandmother's sick, but I don't have my my green card's tentative, so I don't know, like, am I allowed to leave? Am I allowed to go see my mother? So all these like all the stories around you on one end of people who feel disabled, people who feel segregated, people who are, it's not just a feeling, exploited, people who don't have as many choices. And then you go on the other end, and then people are, parents are bringing Chick-fil-A breakfast at random and getting like $200 meals, and like surprising the high schoolers because you're seniors. It just became so much like, everywhere I felt like I was going, the trajectory always brought me back to that question of, there's a problem here. There's a problem of poverty. There's a problem of segregation. There's a problem of resources are not being distributed. And something needs to be done. And there is something being done in Nashville, but Coptic people are not a part of that conversation. Or if they are, they're on an individual basis. It's not as a community. We need to control our own narrative first, which is very important to me. Churches should not be controlling Coptic narrative. Politicians should not be controlling Coptic narrative. The elite and upper class Coptic people should not be controlling and exploiting their own people. But the people themselves, the hundreds in the factories, the thousands in these hotels, these are the people who need to be shaping their narrative. So that's really the essence of Mahaba. When we sat down and we were making the first sketches, Veronica Nashid, my sister Lydia Yousief, and I, when we were sitting around making these sketches, that was the essence of, there are too many people controlling this narrative for their own gain, and for their own self-worth while people are dying. And so at the end of the day, that is what Mahaba is about, is saying that after we are allowed to survive in this country, we can begin to control that narrative and to control how we will be remembered.
I mean, one of the things that I hope that Egypt Migrations is doing is giving a voice to those stories and preserving that. I mean, I'm proud to say that we're the only Egyptian archival institution in the diaspora preserving the histories of Egypt's migrants.
So not just in North America.
In the diaspora. There's no other archival initiative collecting, seeking out, creating, and preserving historical documents, oral histories, photographs, audio, video material, all of that is being preserved and saved at an archive for researchers.
Y'all really inspirational. When I heard about y'all when I was an undergrad, you had no idea the feeling that was like, oh my God, there is a group dedicated for Coptic history. And then just when I started following y'all and then attending the conference and then hearing all these amazing people who were speaking, and it was like people who cared about Coptic history, especially, you know, my whole undergrad experience was like, don't study that. No one's going to help you. Nobody cares. Why don't you just do something about like general Egyptians? And I'm like, Coptic people are general Egyptians. Like, again, the everyday story. And so to be always told like that's not a good, you know, I don't know, what about like, should you be doing minorities? Like, do they really matter in the long term? And I like genuine professors told me that. So to hear like this whole panel of folks who were not religious, like religious leaders, right? Not saying that they're not religious, but religious leaders who are like, we are telling this history, we have researched this history, we are coming with expertise at looking at this history. It was like mind-blowing to me. And it's profound to feel like there's a community out there, and it really pushes you to do the work. At the end of the day, you're just like, if someone's doing that up in Canada, let's join in, or let's feel like we're also a part of this. And I think that's what's happening right now in Coptic history and diaspora, specifically in North America, is like this whole push, like one person leading, you know, we're all doing something very different from each other, but it's like one person starts up in Canada and then someone else starts California, somebody else starts in New York, and then Nashville, and we're all kind of chiming in. I was just journaling about this today, so that's why I was like reading, I don't know, I was going through all of it and sketching it out, and I was like, oh my gosh, we are literally throughout Canada and the US, I'll say, and like in conversation with each other, but still independent as well. So it's just very meaningful that Egypt Migrations kind of started that kind of conversation and started the networking and started, well, our stories do matter, as a beginning point. And then you see this kind of whole online growth from the Coptic community saying, let's keep that up. So, yeah. So I do think like Egypt Migrations is like a big, big thing. I don't think it's very, very momentous, important work that has really paved the ground for all of us to be like, okay, let's do it, you know, that energy. So
I'm just gonna say that I have no words, so let's move on.
Well, y'all started as the Coptic Canadian History Project,
yeah.
And you're now Egypt Migrations, and that was kind of a big transition, I guess, but not really. But I'll let you speak about it and tell us what happened.
More and more, we realized that there's a lot of intersection and a lot of important work that needs to be done on telling stories that the Coptic Canadian History Project could not tell. And also, it became very evident that we were falling into a trap that it seems that a lot of Coptic organizations fall into, and that you become a Coptic only thing. And more likely to be ignored by broader conversations and broader developments, whereas our goal has always been to bring attention and emphasis on the Copts. And so switching to Egypt Migrations was very intentional. We chose the name very intentionally. It's not Egyptian Migrations, it's Egypt Migrations. It doesn't really flow, right? It doesn't, grammatically, it doesn't make sense. But we chose Egypt because we want to talk about Egypt as a space, right? Egypt as a space that has changed over time, right, in geopolitical terms.
Right.
But Egypt as a space of migration into, through, and out of Egypt. Whereas if you say Egyptian, automatically you're giving a national identification to the group that you're talking about, which we're not, right? Like you have the Greeks of Egypt, the Italians of Egypt, the Jews of Egypt, the Copts of Egypt, right? You have varieties of groups living in Egypt, and to the present day, right? Like you're not, often we forget, or in some ways it is intentionally obscured by reporting on Egypt, writing on Egypt, that there are still many minorities residing in Egypt. If you had to summarize Al-Mahaba in 3 words, what would they be and why?
Something that we say is culture, is community, is care. So I would choose those 3 words, that we ask that anyone participating in the organization respect culture. And by that, we don't mean like, you know, you have to like Molokhia and you have to speak Arabic. So we're very much into the intergenerational cultures that are happening here in Nashville in particular. So your kid likes to go to Taco Bell during a Siyam, and that's culture. We're going to label that as culture. And English is part of Coptic culture as well. And our Somali and Ethiopian communities that live with us and work with us are part of our cultures too, and what we're retaining. So like there are a lot of Coptic restaurants now that offer a lot of like just different foods. So they have wings and they have like just the full extent casseroles, because we're in the South, but casseroles are really important. And then it's like molokhia. So you can choose if you want a potato casserole or molokhia. So that's important to us, the respective culture. So there's definitely a clash where folks are saying, well, I'm more Egyptian than you, and well, no, I'm as Egyptian as you. And so coming in and saying that we respect cultures, and there's not one way to be Coptic or Egyptian, and it's okay. We are not going to isolate anyone or outcast anyone, which surprisingly is a very anti-Nashville thing for Coptic communities here, is just to be inclusive. So that's our basis, and then that builds communities, communities that can really value redefining rigid cultural structures. So feeling like someone who wears the galabeya is not respecting the Coptic communities will, in general, to assimilate, right? So this person is stopping us from being respected. So they are against that culture where we have to adapt. So coming in through that narrative and saying we are going to build communities by respecting each other and respecting other cultures is really valuable, because if you can't even respect another Coptic person who may be different from you in Nashville, then how are you going to respect someone who speaks Spanish, someone who's Somali, someone who's Ethiopian? So building those bridges as well. And through those communities, obviously, when you have those networks, you can then offer the care that is needed. And so right now, the care that really is being offered is survival care. So food, tutoring, application assistance, translation. So building unions, building community gardens, building spaces for our children, working against segregation in South Nashville, demanding better working conditions at the state legislature, things like that. You know, so,
it's amazing.
We'll see. We're ambitious. We're very ambitious. We'll see how it goes. What was the inception beyond the archival work? And how has your work evolved?
How we measure our impact is through the stories of people like you who tell us that, you know, we matter.
Yeah.
We take on interns, we take on volunteers, and we recently got a grant that allowed us to pay them, which is a big deal. And yeah, it's about education towards a better future. I know it's very cliche, but it's about allowing youth within our communities to learn about their history, to have informed, critical knowledge, to be able to engage in conversations that move past, you know, shouting and fighting. You know, this is what I heard when I was 5 years old from my great uncle. This is what I heard from the priest following Sunday sermon. This is what I heard from the imam. Like, no. Go and explore for yourself. Here are the resources. Here is the material. Here is, you know, a list of people that you can read and engage with and email them if you have questions. Learn, be critical, figure out what actually happened to the best of your ability. Well, you know, all history is reconstruction. We can never be 100% sure, but to the best of your ability, have a critical understanding of what happened.
Right.
And then when you sit down and you have a debate with someone, then you're having a debate that is informed, that is calm, that is logical, that is, you know, building towards something. It doesn't devolve into fighting and shouting. It builds towards understanding. And I think that's the power that an organization like Egypt Migrations can have on our communities, in that it creates a space for engagement, for critical reflection, and for growth, and for empowering our communities and youth within our communities to be able to have critical discussions, informed discussions, and to learn about their history in a way that suits their needs. Like, you want to listen or watch videos and podcasts, we have that. You want to read short articles, long articles, we have that. You want to do your own thing, we have lists of digital resources, we have resource guides that you can follow your own independent journey and learn on your own terms. There is a physical archive. If you hate, you know, technology, or sitting in front of a computer or on your phone, then go to the physical archive. Right now, it's only in Toronto. But we are working on collaborations with archives and museums in the United States and in France to try to get this material accessible in other parts of the world.
How is this organization, with the tiniest budget, and God knows, you know, like the smallest budget in the world compared to the multi-million organization that is, you know, the Southern Diocese, specifically in Nashville, with like 12 churches. How is this organization the one that's distributing hundreds of masks and sanitary kits during COVID? How is this the organization that's managed to develop a tutoring program? How has this been the organization that is developing relationships with other organizations and supporting communities, instead of going to employers and funneling community members into very abusive labor situations?